What happened to France after Napoleon's ghost, the unfinished revolution, and the Bourbon blunders? What if I told you that Napoleon never truly left France? Oh sure, his body was shipped off to a lonely rock in the Atlantic, but his spirit? That was another story. Because as the Bourbon kings marched back into Paris, thinking they could simply turn back the clock, they soon realized they had a problem. Napoleon's ghost refused to die. The tricolor flag? Still waving in secret. The people? Still singing La Marseillaise under their breath. The Bonapartist dream? Still lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. And oh, did it strike. From conspiracies and assassinations to royalist bloodbaths and revolutionary riots, France stumbled from crisis to crisis, like a drunk man trying to walk a straight line. The Bourbon kings, desperate to hold on to power, made mistake after mistake, until the people had enough. So how did a monarchy, twice restored, get thrown back into the trash heap of history? Why did a random duke's murder push France into yet another revolutionary spiral? And most importantly, how did Napoleon's nephew pull off the greatest comeback since his uncle? This is the story of the Bourbon blunders, the unfinished revolution, and the ghost of Napoleon haunting France's every move. And trust me, you're not going to want to miss a second of it. June 1815. The fields of Waterloo are drenched in blood, the cries of the dying swallowed by the thunderous march of victorious Allied troops. Somewhere amid the chaos, Napoleon Bonaparte, France's once invincible emperor, realizes that the dream is over. The Grande Armée, forged through years of conquest, lies in ruins, and the man who once bent Europe to his will is now nothing more than a fugitive. But Napoleon is not one to go down easily. Oh no, not the man who crowned himself emperor. He hatches a desperate plan: escape to the United States. There, in the land of revolution and opportunity, he might find refuge, rebuild his ambitions, and perhaps, just perhaps, strike again. Napoleon flees to Rochefort, a coastal town, hoping to board a ship to America. The plan? Slip past the Royal Navy and start fresh in the New World. A Napoleonic empire in exile? The thought alone is enough to make King Louis XVIII shudder. But the British, ever the killjoys, have other plans. Their warships form a tight blockade around the French coast. Napoleon, realizing he is trapped, faces a brutal choice: flee like a rat, or surrender with the dignity of a fallen emperor. On July 15, 1815, aboard the British warship HMS Bellerophon, Napoleon surrenders to the Royal Navy, famously declaring, "I come, like Themistocles, to throw myself upon the hospitality of the British people." Themistocles, of course, had found refuge with the Persians. But the British were no Persians. They had no intention of offering Napoleon a comfortable exile. Instead, they shipped him off not to a mansion in the English countryside, but to the most remote, desolate prison they could find, St. Helena, a volcanic rock in the middle of the South Atlantic. And just like that, the emperor was gone. Or was he? With Napoleon out of the picture, at least physically, the Allies, Britain, Russia, Austria, and Prussia, decide to restore the Bourbon dynasty to France. King Louis XVIII, younger brother of the executed Louis XVI, takes the throne. A rather plump and gout-ridden man, Louis XVIII is a relic of the Ancien regime, yet he knows one thing: France has changed. Louis XVIII is no fool. He understands that a return to absolute monarchy is impossible. The French have tasted revolution, and they won't just pretend it never happened. So, when the French Senate invites him to rule as a constitutional monarch, he hesitantly agrees, with conditions. Louis XVIII rejects the Senate's constitution. Why accept someone else's rules when he could make his own? Instead, he issues the Charter of 1814, a political document that borrows some revolutionary ideas, like freedom of religion and press, but makes one thing clear: the king still holds the ultimate power. "This charter is my gift to the people," Louis proclaims. Ah, how generous. A gift that they didn't ask for and couldn't refuse. But Louis XVIII is a pragmatist. He keeps many Napoleonic officials in power, believing their administrative genius could help stabilize the monarchy. He even embraces the Napoleonic Code, the legal framework that still governs France today. One of his advisors sums it up best: whoever served Bonaparte in the interest of France has served the king. Not bad, right? A middle ground between monarchy and revolution. But here's the problem. Not everyone is interested in compromise. Enter the ultra-royalists, the most extreme supporters of the old regime. These guys want a full return to pre-revolutionary France. No democracy, no Napoleonic laws, just good old-fashioned divine right monarchy. Their first move? Undo everything revolutionary. Divorce? Banned. The French tricolor? Outlawed. Revolutionary symbols? Erased. They even try to criminalize any mention of Napoleon. Imagine that, a country trying to erase its most famous figure from history. Louis XVIII, realizing that ultras are alienating the people, dissolves their majority in 1816 and replaces them with more moderate royalists, known as the doctrinaires. This keeps France stable for a while. Despite the Bourbons' best efforts, Napoleon's legend refuses to die. While the government promotes royalist traditions, the people secretly celebrate Napoleon's birthday. While church sermons preach loyalty to the king, French veterans gather in darkened taverns, whispering tales of Austerlitz, Jena, and Moscow. The revolutionary tricolor, long associated with the Republic and Napoleon, started appearing on church towers, the very symbols of the clergy that had once supported the monarchy. To make things worse, rosettes, caps, and banners adorned in the forbidden colors were seen everywhere, worn proudly by those who still held a torch for the fallen emperor. Even more bizarre were the rumors swirling through France. One particularly absurd tale claimed that a newborn baby, moments after entering the world, had let out an astonishing cry of "Vive l'Empereur" 3 times. If a mere infant could recognize Napoleon's greatness, then surely France was still his, right? Meanwhile, songs glorifying Napoleon's campaigns filled the air. And in an act of comedic defiance, royalist holidays meant to celebrate the return of the king were rudely interrupted by cries of "Vive l'Empereur." No sermon, no feast, and no grand procession was safe from spontaneous outbursts of Bonapartist enthusiasm. Of course, these provocations didn't go unnoticed. The hardline royalists, furious that so many French people had abandoned Louis XVIII in favor of Napoleon's last hurrah, were out for blood. Mob violence erupted almost immediately as furious loyalists sought revenge against those they deemed traitors. While Napoleon's 100 days had been swift, the royalist revenge was even swifter. In the south of France, where royalist sentiment ran high, Bonapartists, Jacobin Republicans, and even Protestants, because why not, were hunted down, lynched, and butchered in the streets. Prominent Napoleonic generals, once the heroes of the empire, found themselves targeted for assassination. The Bourbon monarchy was back, and it was determined to purge every last trace of revolutionary and Napoleonic influence from France. But it wasn't just bloodthirsty mobs taking matters into their own hands. The political landscape was a powder keg, with radical royalists on one side and liberals, Republicans, and Bonapartists on the other. If the post-Waterloo years were a royalist revenge tour, they were also a time of persistent revolt. Liberals were unwilling to let France slip back into absolutism, and secret societies dedicated to revolution sprang up across Europe. By 1816, the situation had escalated into armed uprisings. One particularly dramatic rebellion erupted in Grenoble, a city that had welcomed Napoleon with open arms just a year earlier. In 1817, Lyon followed suit, with another failed attempt to overthrow the monarchy. But the most audacious act of resistance came in 1818, when an assassin attempted to take out none other than the Duke of Wellington, the very man who had defeated Napoleon at Waterloo. While the attempt failed, it set alarm bells ringing across Europe. The Bourbons, already paranoid, now saw liberal conspiracies everywhere. And to be fair, they weren't entirely wrong. Revolutionary networks across France, Spain, and Italy were indeed coordinating in secret, fueling the fears of Europe's conservative rulers. Then came 1820, a year that shook France to its core. The Duc de Berry, the king's cousin and the last hope for the Bourbon dynasty, was assassinated by a Bonapartist radical. For many liberals, this was cause for celebration. Some even openly called for the assassination of the king himself. But politically, the assassination backfired spectacularly. The already paranoid monarchy now had the perfect excuse to purge the liberals from power. Hardline ultra-royalists, who believed in absolute monarchy and loathed the revolution, seized control of the government. Through political manipulation, they soon controlled 411 out of 428 seats in the legislature, and with their grip tightening, they set their sights on crushing liberalism at home and abroad. In 1823, the Bourbon monarchy decided that one crushed revolution wasn't enough. They needed to suppress it elsewhere too. France invaded Spain, sending an army known as the 100,000 Sons of St. Louis to restore King Ferdinand VII and crush his liberal parliament. Spanish liberals resisted, but the real trouble came from within. French liberals met the army at the border, waving the tricolor flag and singing La Marseillaise, urging the soldiers to mutiny. Poets, students, and intellectuals declared solidarity with the Spanish cause, further inflaming tensions. But in the end, the ultra-royalists won. After the Battle of Trocadero, Spanish liberalism was crushed, and the Bourbons claimed victory. Yet, their grip over France remained shaky. When Louis XVIII died in 1824, his brother Charles X took over, a man who seemed to have learned absolutely nothing from history. Instead of trying to maintain a balance, Charles doubled down on ultra-royalist policies, making it blatantly clear that he saw the Revolution and Napoleon as mere accidents that needed to be erased. Among his greatest hits, slashing voting rights so that only the wealthiest ultra-royalists could vote. Paying financial compensation to aristocrats who had fled during the Revolution, essentially rewarding them for abandoning France. Expanding the power of the Catholic Church to control education, banning liberal and Enlightenment ideas. Passing a blasphemy law in 1825 that made sacrilege punishable by death. A move so extreme that even some hardline royalists balked. By 1827, the backlash was inevitable. Charles lost the elections, and the French legislature fell out of royalist hands. Yet, instead of adapting, Charles became even more stubborn. By 1830, Charles X had simply had enough of all this pesky democracy nonsense. Freedom of the press? A joke. Voting rights? Overrated. A legislature that didn't bend the knee? How dare they? With the grace of a man determined to set himself on fire, Charles issued the July Ordinances, suspending the press, dissolving the legislature, and further tightening voting rights. This was the 19th century equivalent of walking into a tavern, slapping everyone's drinks away and expecting them to cheer. The French people, however, did not cheer. Liberals, Bonapartists, and even moderate conservatives, who had once tolerated Charles's antics, took this as a declaration of war. The people of Paris, who had gotten quite good at revolting by this point, did what they did best. They built barricades. Over 3 glorious, chaotic days in July, the streets of Paris turned into a revolutionary war zone. Students, workers, and even disgruntled middle-class shopkeepers flooded into the streets, waving tricolor flags and singing La Marseillaise, with the energy of a nation that had done this before and would do it again. Mobs stormed government buildings, occupied city halls, and generally made a mess of things in the name of liberté, égalité, fraternité. Charles X, watching the city burn from his palace, suddenly remembered a very important appointment somewhere far, far away. On August 2, 1830, with a dramatic sigh, Charles X abdicated and fled to England, joining the ever-growing club of exiled French monarchs. But now came the real question: who would rule France? France, weary of guillotines and revolutionary chaos, didn't want another republic. But they also didn't want another Charles X disaster. Enter Louis Philippe, Duke of Orléans, a man rich enough to be a king but smart enough to dress like a commoner. Unlike Charles, who bathed in absolutism, Louis Philippe marketed himself as the citizen king, a relatable monarch, one of the people, a guy who supposedly understood the working class. He even had the audacity to dress in business attire instead of royal robes, as if he had just strolled in from the stock exchange. And so the July monarchy was born. France breathed a sigh of relief. Surely this would be the end of revolutions, right? At first, Louis Philippe's reign seemed promising. The monarchy was constitutional, the economy boomed, and political parties coexisted, somewhat peacefully. He was backed by the bourgeoisie, France's growing middle class, who valued order and economic prosperity over revolutionary zeal. Unlike his predecessors, Louis Philippe was not obsessed with divine right or grand imperial ambitions. Instead, he focused on infrastructure, industrial expansion, and keeping the peace. Under his rule, railroads expanded, connecting cities like never before. Industry thrived, and France became more urbanized. Foreign policy was relatively stable, aside from a few colonial escapades. Everything seemed fine. But there was a problem. Louis Philippe's monarchy catered almost exclusively to the wealthy elite. Despite his early promises of being a man of the people, Louis Philippe quickly became a king of the bankers, businessmen, and landlords. Only 1% of the population could vote, the wealthiest elite. The working class and students, completely ignored. Political corruption ran rampant, making elections a joke. For the poor, wages stagnated while food prices soared. The working class was angry, hungry, and increasingly radical. Paris, ever the city of revolutionaries, was simmering. Even Victor Hugo, yes, that Victor Hugo, mocked Louis Philippe, calling his reign the empire of the middle class. Meanwhile, Bonapartists still longed for another Napoleon. Republicans wanted a true democracy, and socialists began demanding radical reforms. The country was a powder keg. Then, in 1846, economic disaster struck. A financial crisis, poor harvests, and rising unemployment pushed thousands into poverty. By 1848, France was on the brink once again. When the government banned political banquets, public gatherings where liberals and Republicans criticized the regime, the people had enough. On February 22, 1848, protests erupted in Paris. The National Guard, originally sent to disperse the crowds, joined the revolutionaries instead, a classic move at this point. Within days, barricades reappeared. By February 24th, realizing his days were numbered, Louis Philippe dressed as a commoner and fled Paris. Abdicated, of course. He hopped on a boat to England, where he lived out his days eating roast beef and reminiscing about the good old days. With Louis Philippe gone, France declared itself a republic once more. But this time, the people wanted stability. Enter a familiar name. After the February Revolution, France needed a leader. And in the presidential election of December 1848, they overwhelmingly chose a man with a very familiar name, Louis Napoleon Bonaparte. Why? Because the name Bonaparte still held power. To workers, he was the man of the people. To Bonapartists, he was a living link to the glory days. To conservatives, he was a safe alternative to radical socialism. He won in a landslide. But unlike his uncle, Louis Napoleon wasn't content with just a presidency. By 1851, Louis Napoleon realized something. Presidents have term limits. Emperors do not. So on December 2, 1851, exactly 47 years after his uncle's coronation, he staged a coup, dissolved the National Assembly, declared a new constitution, and called for a public referendum. And the people, nostalgic for the past, overwhelmingly supported him. 1 year later, he declared himself Emperor Napoleon III. Under his rule, Paris was redesigned, thanks Baron Haussmann. Railways expanded, making travel easier. Industrialization skyrocketed, modernizing the economy. But Napoleon III also had a dark side. He crushed dissent, goodbye free speech. He ruled with an iron fist, keeping opposition in check. He involved France in costly wars, ultimately leading to his downfall. His reign, once full of promise, ended in disaster after he foolishly challenged Prussia in 1870. He was captured, France declared another republic, and just like his uncle, he ended his days in exile. France, by the end of the 19th century, had gone through 2 Napoleons, 3 monarchies, 2 republics, and countless revolutions. And yet the same tensions between monarchists, republicans, Bonapartists, liberals, and the working class continued to shape its destiny. As history would show, France was never truly done with revolutions.